Welcome to Keep Calm and Carry On, Crisis Communications Tips and Strategies. My name is Melanie Herman. I'm Executive Director of the Nonprofit Risk Management Center. This program is brought to you by the North Carolina Center for Nonprofits, and funding and support for this program was provided by Duke Energy. Just as a reminder, the organization that I work for, the Nonprofit Risk Management Center, works to inspire effective risk management and risk champions in the nonprofit sector. We work with nonprofit leadership teams and work to help them take bold, mission advancing risks. So for today's program, we're going to start with an overview of some resources that I think you'll find relevant, and then we'll delve into what is crisis communications? What do we mean by that phrase, that term? And then I want to share some strategies for staying on message during a crisis, and finally share some tips and takeaways. So let's start with resources. So the first thing is a brand new toolkit for building organizational resilience that's brought to you by the North Carolina Center for Nonprofits with support from Duke Energy. It's available free of charge. You can download it from the North Carolina Center for Nonprofits website. I'm super proud of this resource. It was written by members of my team here at NRMC, and it's filled with really practical advice and insights and suggestions about building resilience in your organization. So if you haven't already downloaded it, make sure you do that as soon as possible and share it with others in your organization. The final webinar in this series of 4 will take place next week, and it's on resilience and resumption, what you need to know and do to get ready for a new normal. So it's all about bringing your program, your organization, your activities back online, bringing your staff back to the office, and how you want to think about that and go about that in a really thoughtful and appropriate way. So I look forward to sharing some tips and strategies on resumption with you next week, and I hope you'll be able to join me for that program as well. Another resource I want to point out is an issue of our magazine, which is called Risk Management Essentials. It's free on our website. And this is an issue that was devoted to the topic of crisis management, and it has a series of terrific articles. So I hope you'll look at that, check those articles out, and download that resource for free and share it with others as appropriate. If you're a member of the North Carolina Center for Nonprofits, you're also a member of the Nonprofit Risk Management Center. I encourage you to create your own login by clicking on that affiliate login button on our website. And creating a login will allow you to get quick access to all of the resources that we offer that are free of charge to members. Simple to create an account. Our website will remember you when you visit us again, and you won't have any delay getting to our webinar vault. One of the things you'll see on that membership page is ask a risk help question, and this is a form you can fill out to ask us a question. You can also call me, and so the phone number is everywhere on the website. It's on my slide deck, on the first slide, on the last slide. It's on this form on the website. And it's interesting, during this pandemic, I've been getting a lot of calls. Some really interesting risk questions have been posed, and it's certainly our pleasure to help you address those and brainstorm with you and think out loud. All right, let's talk about what is crisis communications. And I want to actually start with the definition of crisis. This is a definition I shared in our last webinar together. The idea that a crisis is a change, sudden or evolving, that results in an urgent problem that must be addressed immediately. I also wanted to share an additional definition that I found in doing some recent reading, and the author talked about how a crisis is a combination of surprise, threat, and short response time. And I like how this definition points to the fact that a crisis is specific, it's unexpected, it's a non-routine event, or sometimes a series of events that create high levels of uncertainty and present an organization with both opportunities for and threats to its high priority goals. And I like this definition a lot, actually. I wish I'd found this earlier, but I like the fact that it reminds us that a crisis event is both a threat to what we're trying to achieve as an organization, what we're trying to do, but it's also an opportunity, or presents multiple opportunities. And I've been interested to see so many nonprofit leaders really taking this time while dealing with this pandemic and all of the difficulties that arise as a result of the pandemic, to make their organizations stronger and more effective, and to take time to reflect on how can we be an even better and stronger organization in the future. So as I was researching the definition of crisis communications, I found three that I wanted to share with you. The first is from Wikipedia, which references or describes crisis communications as a subset of public relations. The second is from a company called Rock Dove Solutions, which is technologies and systems and protocols. And then the third is from the Business Dictionary, and this one's kind of interesting. The effort by a company to communicate with the public when an event occurs that could have a negative impact on the company's reputation. So I don't know how you feel about these definitions, but I felt a little cold after reading these definitions, and I felt like they weren't as appropriate for nonprofit organizations, that we're not just worried about our reputation when we're in a crisis and we're focused on crisis communications. So my colleague Whitney Tomey and I this morning were brainstorming some possible nonprofit definitions of crisis communications, and I want to show you what we came up with. So the first one is the idea that crisis communications is mission-focused messaging and dialogue with stakeholders during a crisis. And we chose these words really carefully. We understand that we've got to continually focus on our mission and remind people about what we do, what's the essence of our organizations. And I also like the word dialogue in here because crisis communication is not just a one-way exercise. It's not just you telling your stakeholders something. It's you listening to your stakeholders and engaging and connecting with them. So I think that word dialogue is important. So that's our first definition that we came up with. And the second one is the idea that crisis communications is informing your community with mission-focused messaging, inspiring confidence and comfort in times of crisis. I love the second one. This was authored by Whitney. So she gets credit for that. So these are our brand new definitions of crisis communications that we thought were just a little bit warmer and friendlier and seem to fit better with what each of us is doing leading a nonprofit organization. All right, now let's turn to staying on message during a crisis. So the first thing under this subtopic for today I want to raise is that there are different types of risk communication. There are different purposes. There are different things that give rise to the need to communicate during a crisis. And this is from a resource by Peter Sandman and Jody Leonard. It goes back a few years. And I really like this framework, the idea that sometimes we're communicating in the middle of a crisis, we're communicating in a fashion that where we're trying to alert people to hazards when they are apathetic. And some of you are probably thinking that some of that may be true right now with a pandemic, that some of the people you've tried to communicate to and communicate with about the pandemic have kind of brushed you off and felt like this somehow doesn't apply to them, or this is not important, or this is overblown. So that's called precaution advocacy. And then the second type of risk communication is outrage management, where we're trying to reassure people about minor hazards. And as you know, fear, something that sometimes people feel, and it doesn't always match reality, right? So sometimes we're more fearful of things they're less dangerous, and we're less fearful of things that are more dangerous. But there are times in most nonprofit organizations' existence that you do have to engage in this outrage management where you're trying to calm people's fears. I don't think this is the time. I wouldn't call this a minor hazard, the current pandemic. And then the third type is kind of true crisis communication, where you're guiding people through serious hazards when they are appropriately upset. And this message of we'll get through this together, and this is what you need to do. I think has been a fundamental piece of our communications during COVID-19. So the next strategy I wanted to share with you is I want to urge you to try to simplify your message. Whenever you're trying to communicate during a crisis, keep in mind that people are multitasking, they're focused on many issues, they're fearful, they're busy. And I think some of us make the mistake of trying to cram too many pieces of information into one communication. And I'm sure like me, you're receiving lots and lots of e-newsletters and emails on a daily basis, and lots of communications coming at you from every company you've ever bought something from your vendors you work with regularly, from many sources. And one of the things that strikes me with so many of those messages is how complicated they are, how I have to scroll for a couple of minutes to get to the bottom of the message. So I would encourage you to try to simplify your messages as you're engaging in risk communication. And what I've shown here is just a very simple framework, right? So we care, we're here, and this is how you can help us. Um, 3 messages, and I think that rule of 3 is something that works well and is worth thinking about as you develop communications in your organization, communications messages. All right, so my next strategy is to focus on who, what, and how. So the who is who needs to hear from you. The what is what do they need to hear? What do they need to know? And then also what will you say? And then the how will you reach your audiences? And so one of the things I often do when I'm trying to make sure I'm covering the bases is I create a simple chart, just a cheat sheet, just a way to remind myself of what I need to do. And so for this, I thought, you know what, who, what, how? Let me make a list across the top of the different people and audiences and stakeholder groups that I need to communicate with during a crisis, and make a list. So I came up with clients, staff, donors, general media, and public. This could be a much longer list. You might want to do this in a spreadsheet. It might include your board of directors. It might include volunteers. It might include institutional funders versus individual donors. So your list could go on, but I just wanted you to see an example of what this type of tool might look like. And then under what, I want you to think about what do they need to hear, or what do they need to know, and what will you say, and fill in those boxes with some of those messages. So I just thought, what might a client want to know? They might want to know if you're open. They want to know if there are any new services you're providing. They might want to know if certain services are no longer available. Maybe they've been temporarily discontinued or permanently discontinued. Staff probably want to know, is it safe to come to work? Are you flexible? Is my job safe? Have the policies changed? And so forth. So you can see this type of chart, or this cheat sheet, is just a way to remind you of some of the things you want to keep in mind as you're engaging in crisis communication, as you're engaging in that dialogue with different stakeholder groups about a particular crisis. So as you think about what, I want you to consider breaking it down even further. I think to some extent, and this framework may be helpful, you may want to add additional pieces to it, but to some extent we want to talk about the event itself, the crisis, the event that's happened in our community. And the other side of the coin, though, is we want to talk about what we're doing, what's happening to us, what our response has been. So with respect to the event, with COVID-19, many of us are trying to share some of the latest information and insights from government and public health authorities. If we're looking ahead to severe weather during the summer and in the fall, we probably want to be sharing information from the National Weather Service and other credible organizations. And I want to encourage you, though, to think about what other crisis events can we imagine at this point. And COVID-19 has been so all-consuming for so many of us and our organizations. But what are some other crisis events you can imagine? And now's the time to start thinking about who are the credible sources of information for those types of events. Now, in the last webinar on crisis management, I reminded everybody that in general, when you're doing crisis management planning, you want to focus on impacts instead of events. Now, there's a tendency to just list all the events that could happen and then come up with specific responses to each event. Whereas so many events have similar impacts. So the best example is, whether it's a hurricane, a severe weather event, an act of terrorism, or COVID-19, your staff are impacted. They may not be able to come to work. They may be prevented from coming to work. So it's the same impact or a similar impact with very different types of events. So when we're thinking about a crisis management plan, again, I want you to focus on impacts, but when you're thinking about crisis communications, it's important to think about events because different types of events have different sources of credible information. And you don't want to be trying to find that credible information in the middle of a crisis. You want to have that available. Know who are your go-to resources, those authorities, those sources of information. So then when it's time to think about all about you and what you're doing, what's happening? What are you doing to protect people? How is your audience likely to be impacted? And, in some cases, your response describing how you're going to protect your clientele and your consumers and your staff and volunteers and so forth, your responses may be similar. And so that's a great reminder that you can start crafting those crisis communications messages now in anticipation of the next crisis event. So a couple of years ago, I had a chance to hear Hal Gregersen, who teaches at MIT, give a keynote presentation at a conference I was attending. And one of the things I loved about his presentation was he posed some really interesting questions to the audience, right? And so many keynote speakers just come in and I have all the answers. Gregersen's approach is to ask a lot of questions. And his book, I just ordered his book and haven't started reading it yet, but his book is called Questions Are the Answer. And as I was thinking about crisis communications, I was thinking that, when you're responsible for crisis communications, when it's your job to communicate with people, you may worry that you have to have all the answers and this is all about you sharing everything you know and understand with an audience or with multiple audiences. But keep in mind that part of crisis communications is being willing to ask questions. And so don't be afraid to ask. If you're talking to your staff, talking to clients and consumers, what do you need to feel safe or safer? And just as a reminder, the slide deck will be available as soon as we wrap up. So you don't have to write down all of these quotes and the text that you see in front of you. Those slides will be made available to you. So I love this quote from Questions Are the Answer about, it makes sense to remind yourself to admit and embrace being a little more wrong and immerse yourself in situations where you feel less right. All right, some additional strategies. We want to focus on details, transparency, and again, questions, as Hal Gregersen reminds us. And with respect to detail, you always want to be able to provide enough detail to be informative without getting bogged down with unnecessary minutia. And again, going back to those emails that we're all getting, some of the organizations we're hearing from are giving us lots and lots of information that we don't really need right now. And so any chance you have to condense the information, provide information that people need to know and want to know without going into great details, or just providing links where they can go find that additional information, that you'll be better off. And transparency is so important. So many nonprofits boast about their transparency and how that's an important value. And yet sometimes in a crisis, we're not as transparent as we ought to be. And so I always tell people to err on the side of being more transparent than even you're comfortable being. And that includes sometimes letting people know what you know and even how you reach certain decisions. So it's not enough sometimes to just say, we decided to close or we decided to eliminate this program. Sometimes you need to go a bit more. People want to know why. And if you don't tell them why, they make up reasons why and they imagine the worst possible reasons. And of course, always provide an opportunity to ask questions. Crisis communications is two-way. It's a dialogue. It's not just you giving a speech or reading a press release. Something really important to do as part of your crisis communications work is to clarify who is our spokesperson. And this is the only person or persons who are authorized to speak on behalf of your organization. And it should be somebody who has some good experience, who's been trained for this role, who's up to the role, if you will. And it might be your CEO, but sometimes it isn't your CEO. And when it shouldn't be your CEO is when that person is not comfortable speaking to the public, being the spokesperson. So when that person's not comfortable doing it, but also I would just encourage you to think, if you are the CEO of your organization, just think about your own personality and how you come across. And if you don't have a warm personality, if you don't come across as empathetic and caring, you might want to find somebody else to be the spokesperson for your organization in a crisis. And you could be an incredibly effective leader and not have a really warm personality. I've certainly worked with some great CEOs that are a bit cold. Many years ago, I actually was asked by an organization to speak to one of their chapter CEOs about a crisis, and it was about an organization that was doing a fundraising event where a young woman was killed while participating in a fundraising event. She was hit by a car, and it was an event where they're raising money through bicycling. And so I called the CEO and we were talking, and she said, First of all, I used to work in media and public media, so I know what I'm doing. So don't worry about me. I know exactly what I'm doing. And then she said something I'll never forget. She said, in any ways, the woman that was killed, she and her husband hadn't been married very long. And I stopped in my tracks. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. She was basically saying, it's sad, but they hadn't been married that long. I immediately called the national office and told them, in my view, this is somebody who should not be a spokesperson. She was so cold when she was talking about the death of this young woman who was raising money for her nonprofit. Just awful. All right, last tip on this topic is make sure that everybody who's not your spokesperson knows they're not your spokesperson. This is sometimes something that people forget to do. And as a result, we end up having people speaking for organizations who aren't authorized because they simply didn't know. So the person who is a spokesperson needs to know they are it, but everybody else needs to know they are not it. Really, really important to take care of that. This was an article that was a Harvard Business School blog about how professionals, learning and development professionals, can lead through the pandemic. And just a few tips, again, reminding us that communication is not a one-way, one-time thing, that crisis communication is about keeping communication lines open. It's also about showing empathy and about transparency. So a couple of things we've already talked about. So when you're in that spotlight, when you are the person, you're the spokesperson, when you're delivering messages, when you're being asked questions, keep in mind, if you don't know, say so. It's so much more important to say you don't know than to make something up and to guess. Make sure that you're sincere and compassionate when you're delivering messages during a crisis. And one of the mistakes I've seen some nonprofits make is to say things like, well, this is a terrible thing, but nobody in our location got hurt, or the people that were hurt, or the people who died, you know, they're in another part of the community, or they're not our customers, they're not our clients. And without realizing it, that comes across as so cold. So, you know, a victim anywhere is a victim everywhere. And I've particularly seen this in crises involving abuse, where somebody has said, well, he or she doesn't work here anymore, or the child that was hurt didn't attend our programs, as if that matters to the person receiving the information. That you know, what you should be saying is that this is a terrible tragedy, and not pointing fingers elsewhere. So just keep that in mind. Accommodate reasonable requests. So right now we're in an unusual crisis situation where we're not giving interviews at our office, but many times after a crisis, the media would like to do an interview right in front of the building that's been damaged by the hurricane or by the tornado. And sometimes it feels a little uncomfortable accommodating that type of request, but that's part of how the media, the world of media works. And so I would encourage you to accommodate reasonable requests. And again, when you're being interviewed on an issue related or crisis that your organization is facing, it's a chance for you to get information out into the general public, and it's going to reach people far faster than you could do by telephone calls and by emails. And then, of course, always admit when a mistake has been made. That's a good way to start reestablishing your credibility. So additional ways to stay on message, the 5 C's of risk communication or crisis communication: showing care, showing that you're committed, right? Being consistent, being coherent. And with coherence, I'll just remind you, now's not the time to use jargon. When you're communicating during a crisis, people have short attention spans, they're anxious and fearful. Be as coherent as possible. And clarity kind of goes hand in hand with coherence, but just a reminder, be clear. Be clear about what you expect people to do, about what you know, and about what you don't know. All right, some final tips and takeaways before we wrap up. The first is from a terrific article called Real Leaders Are Forged in Crisis, and it's from the Harvard Business Review. And I love how the author talks about the fact that leaders need to be both brutally honest and offer credible hope. So we're balancing a lot of things at the same time: brutal honesty and credible hope. And you know, she reminds us at the end of this quote that, you know, explain that you understand how scary things feel, but you can work together to weather the storm. And I think this last line in this quote is really what we're hearing from so many businesses, so many nonprofits, so many public agencies. It's really been the message. We're in this together during this current pandemic. And I think it's one of the things that's made it so unusual, because with so many other crisis events, they're typically isolated to a particular community, to a particular organization, to a region of the world. Another tip is in a crisis, use your crisis communications opportunities to give people a role and a purpose. Let people know what they can do, how they can help. I think in a crisis, we often feel kind of lost and we're not quite sure where to go. But if we have that goal, if we know we're trying to get to the other side of this bridge, it gives us something to focus on that kind of takes our minds off of other things. And I've heard from so many people recently that part of their coping skills has been having specific things they have to get done, and that working through this pandemic has actually been very helpful to their psyche, to their well-being. I also want to remind you that now is the time to be patient and forgiving. And um, as you're dealing with a crisis, you may need people to do some things differently and experiment and try things they've never done before. And some of those experiments won't go well. Some of that learning will be challenging, but it's so important to remember that it's okay to experiment, and we are learning as we get through this. And I just had an email from a board member this morning. We sent out our e-news and one of the links didn't work. And she wrote back to me and she said, you know what, we're all human. We make mistakes. One broken link in an e-news is not the end of the world. And I thought, you know what, that's all about being patient and forgiving with others, but also with ourselves. This quote is from the article I mentioned before, Real Leaders Are Forged in a Crisis. And it's all about the fact that crises take a toll and they lead to burnout, but they can be devastating if you've suffered a loss in your own family, lost a friend. And she reminds us that we want to keep our finger on the pulse of our team's energy and emotions and respond appropriately. So again, it may feel like just normal communications to you, but if your agency is in the middle of a crisis, you're practicing crisis communications. And this is a tip from many, many years ago when I first started teaching crisis management, the idea that sometimes we face toxic worry. And it's worry that happens when it doesn't need to. And it's actually worry that causes us to be almost paralyzed and leads us to freeze up. So we need to find ways to communicate over and over again that that we want to focus and do what we can with the resources we have available to us, and ultimately want to take care of ourselves, right? So put our own mask on first, the device that we get when we're on an airplane. And then this is an article from Sage Publications called Ethical Crisis Leadership, which says that a crisis doesn't build character, it actually exposes the character of an organization that already existed. And so I'm hoping that so many of the nonprofits we work with and so many of the nonprofits within the North Carolina Center for Nonprofits, that you are organizations that believe in openness, honesty, responsibility, accountability, and trustworthiness. And those values were deeply grounded in your organization before COVID-19 happened. And I would just encourage you, if there's some cracks in the armor, or, if there are some areas where you're not as strong as you need to be, I would encourage you to think about how do we get to that place where we're open, honest, responsible, accountable, and trustworthy, so that we'll be in the best possible position when we face a crisis in the future. And then I want to encourage you to think about the future and not just think about the present. It's hard to do it when you're focused on the here and now. But it's so important for the health of your organization, the health of everybody associated with your organization, to think about the future, right? To say we're going to learn from mistakes, we're going to be optimistic. And I like that idea of being boldly optimistic, and to emphasize rebuilding, not blame. One of the huge mistakes that happens when things go wrong is there's a tendency to focus on who is at fault? Who can we point fingers at? And the truth is there are many silver linings, and learning is one of them from every crisis. And we need to focus on the future and be optimistic. I want you to also think about getting ready for the next time, the next crisis. And if you don't already have a crisis communications plan or a crisis management plan that includes crisis communications, I want you to put one together, and you can see on this slide some tips for what that plan should include. You can take a look at that in your free time when you have a moment. So I want to close by offering some suggestions, something that I learned years ago. I read an interesting, a fascinating article about a skydiver whose name is Cheryl Stearns. So she's known for having done She achieved a record. She's a record holder for doing the most parachute jumps by a woman. She's had completed 21,000 parachute jumps as of June 2019. She also is a record holder for doing the most number of parachute jumps in one 24-hour period. She did 352 jumps. And she said a couple of things in this interview that was featured in Fast Company many years ago, which I think are really relevant to crisis communications and crisis management. The first is take nothing for granted. You have to practice. And she said that, being a skilled skydiver isn't luck. It's all about practice. And she's obsessed with practice. She's done 21,000 jumps. She also said in the article, look before you leap, but know what to look for. So she's known for target parachuting. So, and she talks in the article about how many people who get injured or killed parachuting, skydiving, do so because they're not focused on where they're going to land. They just jump out of an airplane and they want to land somewhere over there in a field. Her entire career has been all about picking a target and focusing on that target. And she said, if you focus on a target, you're far more likely to have a successful, safe jump than if you don't. And then her last piece of advice I think is incredibly relevant, and that is, she says, some people think that the key to being good at parachuting or skydiving is not being afraid. And she said, that's wrong. People that have no fear actually get hurt more often than people that are fearful. And she said every time she jumps out of a plane, she has fear. It's the right kind of fear. It doesn't paralyze her, but it helps her focus on what she's trying to accomplish. And she says too much confidence is dangerous. So I think that's true. Whether you're standing in front of your staff, whether you're doing a video call with staff and volunteers, whether you're talking to donors on the phone, whether you're standing in front of a microphone doing a media interview, it's okay to be fearful, but make sure that you've practiced and make sure that you have a goal in mind, that you look before you leap and know what to look for. So I thought those tips from Cheryl Stern seemed really relevant and timely right now as we're all dealing with the current pandemic and thinking about future crisis events that might affect our organizations. I want to thank you for joining me today for this program. If you have any specific questions you'd like to send my way, please contact me by phone or by email. I would love to hear from you. We call that Risk Help, and it's free because if you're a member of the North Carolina Center for Nonprofits, you're also a member of the Nonprofit Risk Management Center, and that's a service that we offer. So thanks, everybody. I hope these slides are helpful. You'll receive them shortly. Please feel free to share them with anybody in your organization. Thanks, everyone.